Hello everyone. Today's video we will relax with the story about a girl who was only 19 years old, but terrified an entire empire. And then she was burned alive in the middle of a public square, amidst the laughter of her enemies and the dumbfounded eyes of her people. That story begins in a small village, nestled on the edge of the French forest, where no one expected to give birth to a person that to this day, the whole world still cannot stop arguing. Jeanne d'Arc. Jeanne was not a princess, not a noble, not an inch of power. Her parents were just farmers. The father was a farmer, the mother was a weaver. Their life was simple, quiet, and seemed never to touch the light of history. But Jeanne was different. From a young age, she had a distant gaze, eyes that seemed to penetrate the core of other people's souls. And what was most special, she said that she heard voices from heaven. At the time, France was in the midst of the darkest period of the 100 Years' War, a war between France and England that had lasted not a few years, but more than a century. English troops had taken over much of the country, including the capital city of Paris. The French king, Charles VII, had not yet been officially crowned, and in the midst of this turmoil, a 13-year-old girl claimed to have received a call from Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, saints who told her to go and save France. It sounded crazy. A peasant girl who couldn't read or write was talking to gods. But Jeanne didn't care what people thought. She began her journey by convincing a local military commander, Robert de Baudricourt, that she needed to be taken to King Charles VII. At first, he laughed at her. But strangely enough, after a series of bizarre events, including Jeanne accurately predicting a French defeat, he began to change his mind. Finally, Jeanne was escorted to the king, who was still a vagabond and had not yet been officially recognized. During one of the trials, Charles VII disguised himself as a commoner and had another noble sit on the throne. Jeanne entered the room and went straight to the disguised commoner, knelt down, and called him king, much to the astonishment of the entire court. How could a country girl recognize him among hundreds of people? Jeanne's answer: God showed me the way. From that moment on, the whole court began to pay attention. Of course, they did not immediately send troops to Jeanne. First, she was subjected to examinations, both medical and religious. They wanted to make sure that she was not possessed by demons, not a witch, and especially that she was really a virgin, because in the superstitious thinking of the Middle Ages, a virgin chosen by the gods had divine powers, and Jeanne passed all of them. She was given armor, a standard, and an army, a real army. Jeanne didn't just fight, she led it. That was unthinkable at the time. In a society where women were seen as weak and dependent, Jeanne stood alongside seasoned generals. But not because of tactics, but because of conviction. Jeanne was no expert in military strategy, but she had what the desperate French needed: hope. The first battle she fought in Orleans was a turning point. The city had been under siege by the English for months. Everyone believed it would fall, and that if Orleans was lost, France would be beyond redemption. But when Jeanne appeared, the morale of the people and the army was ignited. Within days, the French were fighting back fiercely, and Jeanne was wounded several times, but did not leave the line. And then, the unthinkable happened. Orleans was relieved. The whole country seemed to wake up from a nightmare. Jeanne was soon called the heroine of Orleans. Rumors about her spread everywhere. Some said she was an angel, others a witch. But whatever the case, Jeanne changed the game. She then convinced Charles VII to hold his coronation in Reims, a symbolic city where French kings had traditionally been crowned. Jeanne led her army through dangerous territory, fighting countless small battles, and eventually fought her way to Reims. And in 1429, Charles was officially crowned king, with Jeanne standing by his side, holding a white flag. That was the peak, and also the beginning of the young girl's unstoppable fall. Because power is never simple. Once Charles was crowned, he began to listen to his old advisors, who did not like Jeanne. They considered her too dangerous a daughter, not only because of her persuasiveness, but also because she did not listen to anyone, only saying, "I do the will of God." And someone who acted in the name of God, not following any system, was always a threat to the ruling class. Meanwhile, the English and their allies, especially the Burgundians, viewed Jeanne as a heretic who needed to be eliminated. So when she led her army to Compiègne in 1430 and was captured, England celebrated. Jeanne was sold to the English as a commodity. From then on, her fate was no longer in her own hands. In the following part, we will enter the darkest period of Jeanne's life, when faith is weighed down by power, when justice is distorted by religion, and when a girl is dragged into the middle of the square to be burned alive to the cheers of those who claim to be in the name of God. Joan of Arc was captured at Compiègne in May 1430. It was not the English who captured her, but their allies, the Burgundians. Joan did not resist. "If it is God's will," she declared, "I will be saved." But this time, there was no miracle. No ransom was sent from the French court. No mysterious knights broke into her prison. No escape fell from the sky. Charles VII, who had relied on her to gain the throne, remained silent. The silence was more terrible than betrayal. The Burgundians held her for months, then sold her to the British for 10,000 livres, a high price, not because of her human value, but because of her symbolic value. Jeanne was more than a girl. She was a living symbol of the French resistance. If they could destroy her, the British believed, they could break the spirit of the entire nation. But killing a heroine in public would have made her a martyr. They needed a better reason, and the most convenient way, calling her a heretic, because in the Middle Ages, heresy was not just a violation of religious doctrine, it was a violation of the social order. A person who claimed to hear God's voice without the mediation of the church and dared to give orders to generals, even kings, was clearly a threat to the power structure of both the ecclesiastical and imperial governments. So, in December 1430, Jeanne was taken to Rouen, a city under English control, to await trial. She was not brought before a civil court, but an ecclesiastical court, and that was the key point, because if she had been tried as an ordinary criminal, she would have been beheaded or hanged. But if she had been convicted of heresy, the ultimate punishment would have been burning at the stake. The entire trial was overseen by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a pro-Anglo who had been rejected for promotion by Charles VII. He had a grudge against the French crown and saw Jeanne as the perfect tool to bring it down. The trial began in February 1431, lasted more than 3 months, and was one of the strangest in history, as the accused, Jeanne, had no lawyer, no witnesses, no right to object, and was held in a military prison rather than the religious prison, which was against church law at the time. Jeanne was not easily subdued, however. Each time they cornered her, she responded with an intelligence that surprised many experienced priests. When they asked her, "Do you believe that God is guiding you?" Jeanne replied, "If God abandons me, I am nothing, but if he is with me, you can do nothing to me." One of the most striking moments of the trial came when Jeanne was asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, a trick question. If she answered yes, she was considered arrogant. If she answered no, she was admitting she was a sinner. But Jeanne replied, "If I am not in God's grace, may he bring me in. If I am, may he keep me." That answer left the entire clergy in the room speechless. A young woman with no education, no theological training, reacting with the wisdom of a scholastic scholar. But no matter how talented she was, Jeanne was just a pawn in a political game. Accusations began to mount. At first they tried to prove that Jeanne was a witch, that she used magic to deceive people, that the voices she heard were from the devil. There was no evidence. Then they turned to criticism of her clothes. Yes, clothes. Jeanne wore men's clothing, armor, riding breeches, which the church of the time considered a violation of God's law. But Jeanne made it clear, I dressed like that to protect myself. When I was in the military prison, if I wore a skirt, they would touch me. When I wore men's clothing, they were afraid. No one could argue, but they still charged her. The pressure mounted. Jeanne was isolated, threatened, slept in chains, and interrogated daily without a lawyer. At one point, she was on the verge of collapse. And then one day, they took her to the middle of the square, built a pyre, and told her that if she did not sign a confession, she would be burned alive. Jeanne, who had been strong for months, broke down for the first time. She signed the confession with trembling hands, which was later discovered to be a lengthy document that she had not even read. In return, she was sentenced to life in prison. But the truth was, the church didn't want Jeanne to live long. Just 5 days later, the guards found her dressed as a man again, so they used that excuse, that she had relapsed into heresy, and handed down the verdict, burning, an unappealable sentence, a dead end. In May 1431, Joan of Arc, the girl who had saved a country, was dragged into the middle of the square in Rouen, where a towering pyre had been erected, and the crowd gathered, not to save her, but to watch, like a spectacle. They shouted, they pushed, they laughed. But Joan remained silent. She did not cry. She did not beg. Before the flames touched her, she raised her head and shouted, "Jesus, Jesus." Those were the last words Jeanne d'Arc left to the world. In the next part, we will come to her final hours, an execution prepared as if it were a public ceremony, a ritual full of blood and fire. And then, what made Jeanne go from a cursed heretic to a saint later canonized by the Church? Early in the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken from her cell. No chains, no final reading of the sentence, no farewells. She wore only a long, white, thin shirt that fluttered in the morning breeze. A soldier approached and tied her hands behind her back, and from that moment on, she was no longer the girl from Domrémy, but the Jeanne of symbols, the Jeanne of fear, the Jeanne of faith and justice, the Jeanne whose name would change history forever. She was taken to the old market square in Rouen, where a pyre of dry wood had been built, twice as tall as a person. There was no cross, no priest to accompany her. Jeanne looked up, saw a gray sky and a dense crowd, jostling and pushing as if waiting for a play. Some came out of curiosity, some because they hated her. Some silently came to cry. On the stake, she stood still, calm, her eyes devoid of fear. When the priest tried to preach a final mercy, Jeanne interrupted him and said, "I have not committed heresy. All I have done is follow the command of God." Her voice was clear, unshaken. The soldiers standing around looked at each other. Did this really deserve to be burned alive? It is said that, just before the fire was lit, Jeanne asked for one last thing, a cross. No one had brought one. And then, a British soldier, the one tasked with killing her, took off his belt, went to a nearby church, and took a small wooden cross. That act, a moment of humanity amid a sea of brutality, brought tears to many. The cross was placed in Jeanne's hands, but she was so tied up that she could not hold it. So a monk named Isambard de la Pierre climbed onto the pyre and held the cross in front of her during the last minutes. It is said that even the British soldiers turned away. Many could not bear the sight. Jeanne uttered her last cry, a voice that seemed to tear the square apart. "Jesus, Jesus." And then the fire broke out. No one will forget the smell of burning skin, the crackling of wood, the screams of pain that quickly died away. Jeanne burned alive for nearly 15 minutes, with the wind and flames soaring into the sky. When everything was gone, the remaining ashes were gathered, but the British would not let anyone keep any of the ashes or bones. They feared she would be venerated as a martyr, so they ordered a second and a third, burning until Jeanne was nothing but dust. Then the ashes were dumped into the Seine, as if trying to erase any trace of her existence. But ashes never erase memories. Just 20 years later, With the English driven from France and Charles VII, the king who had silently abandoned Jeanne, now firmly on the throne, a retrial was held. This time, it was to clear Jeanne of her innocence. Dozens of witnesses were called, including those who had personally interrogated her, guarded her, and even clergy who had witnessed the burning. Many broke down in tears as they recounted the story. One of the most shocking testimonies came from the English captain of the guards who had ordered the burning of Jeanne. "I burned a holy man. I thought I burned a saint." In 1456, the church officially declared Jeanne innocent, overturning all previous sentences. But that could not bring her back. Statues of her were erected in Orleans, in Reims, in Paris. They began to mention her in prayers, in history books, in the hearts of the nation. And then, after hundreds of years, in 1920, nearly 500 years after Jeanne's death, Pope Benedict XV officially canonized her. Jeanne d'Arc, from a heretic, became Saint Jeanne, the patron saint of France. And the question the world has always asked is, how could a 17-year-old girl, without power, without education, without status, make an empire tremble? How could an inner voice overcome thousands of cries on the battlefield and echo to this day? The answer is not simple. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was the hand of history that pushed her into the storm of a century. But whatever the reason, Jeanne d'Arc will always be niche, a phenomenon that will never be repeated, a figure that neither the church nor the battlefield can control. She is both victim and hero, both the one burned alive and the one burning in the minds of millions. In the next part, we will take a deeper look at Jeanne not through her achievements, but through the person she was, a young woman with great dreams, a child given meaning by history, and a living symbol crushed in the vortex of power, religion, and war. When people mention Jeanne d'Arc, the first image that comes to mind is often a female warrior in armor, riding a horse into battle. But in this part, let's put aside the glory of battle to get closer to Jeanne. Not the symbol, but the person. A young girl from a small village on the Meuse River, with simple dreams, but caught up in a historical whirlwind from which she could never escape. Domrémy, Jeanne's hometown, was a quiet place on the border between Charles VII's loyalist lands and Burgundian-controlled territory. The village was so small that there was no school, and Jeanne, like most children in the countryside, had never had a formal education, let alone a Bible study. But she had a wonderful memory. Her mother said that Jeanne was devout, prayed often, and never missed a service. That girl had eyes that could talk to God. People in the area used to say, "We don't know exactly when Jeanne began to hear voices." She said she was around 13. While working in the fields, she heard a strange voice, not threatening, not scary, but peaceful. Then she saw visions of St. Michael, then St. Catherine, and St. Margaret. From these voices, she was guided, instructed, and given a mission that seemed almost insane: to liberate France, to crown Charles king in Reims. Imagine this: a teenage girl who had never left her village, who could neither read nor write, dared to approach the local commander and claim that she needed to see the king because God had sent her. To anyone at the time, this was not just delusional but dangerous, because it went against the strict hierarchy of power between the church, the nobility, and the king. But Jeanne did not back down. After being repeatedly rejected, dismissed as crazy, she was finally allowed to see the king, and it all started from there. Remarkably, when she first met Charles VII, he deliberately disguised himself as an ordinary nobleman, allowing someone else to sit on the fake throne. But Jeanne, who had never met Charles, walked straight up to him, among dozens of robed men, and knelt down to the right person. She whispered something that only the two of them would know. And from that moment on, Charles believed that she was chosen by God. Many historians today believe that it was Jeanne's absolute, even extreme, faith that became her most powerful weapon. In an era when the whole of France was crumbling, divided, and constantly defeated, A girl who believed that she was sent by God was exactly what everyone needed. Not a strategist, but a belief that could be contagious. Jeanne was the virus of that belief, exploding, spreading throughout the barracks, throughout the people, from soldiers to generals. All were drawn in like a whirlwind. But the harsh truth was, the very people she had rescued, the ones who had shouted, "Long live Joan of Arc," were also the first to turn their backs on her when she had outlived her usefulness. After Charles VII ascended the throne, he no longer needed a female warrior. He needed stability, needed peace, needed to please the church. And Jeanne, who heard the voice of heaven, who never bowed, who dared to ignore the king's orders when she felt it was against God's will, became a burden. She went on to fight again, but this time without resources, without support. She was captured, and what was chilling was the uncharacteristic silence from the royal family. Charles VII sent no envoys, no gold ransom, no pressure on the Burgundians. Jeanne once declared, "If I am captured, may the king think of me." But he did nothing. The most heartbreaking question here is not why Jeanne was burned alive, but why so easily. A woman who had liberated Orleans, paved the way for her coronation, become a living legend, was quietly abandoned, sold like a commodity. It could be said that Jeanne did not die of heresy. She died of silence, the silence of those who worshipped her. But more deeply, Jeanne died because she did not belong to her time. A woman wearing armor to battle, speaking directly to God, not bowing to a king or a bishop, was unacceptable in the 15th century. She was burned not just for dressing as a man. She was burned for doing what women were not allowed to do. In the next section, we will explore Jeanne's far-reaching impact after her death, from politics to culture to art. How did a country girl become an icon that transcends time, borders, and is remembered as a fire goddess in the minds of people? The death of Joan of Arc was not just the end of a person. It was the beginning of a legend. Because the strangest thing was, the more they tried to burn her, the more they fanned the symbol of Joan. Although her ashes were scattered in the Seine, the memory of Joan permeated every corner of France. Without the church declaring her a saint, people called her saint from the moment the flames died down. Even those who burned her alive could not stem the tide of emotion. Only a few years after Jeanne's death, when the people learned that Charles VII had continued to rule, not through politics, but through victory, they began to look back. Who put him on the throne? The answer was Jeanne, a girl without an army, without money, without nobility, but who breathed new life into a dying country. And so the faith began to grow. Folk songs about her spread like wildfire across a dry field. People painted Jeanne on church walls, engraved her name in prayer books. While the church was divided and hesitant, the people canonized Jeanne out of the sobbing of their hearts. One of the things that makes Jeanne's image live forever is the obvious contrast between her and the world around her. While the priests were scheming, the generals were fighting for power, the kings were silent. Jeanne stood tall, seeking nothing but God's will. She became a symbol of justice, of the little ones who were trampled but refused to submit. And this is what made her a perfect niche, unrepeatable, irreplaceable. After her death, France changed. The English lost the initiative. Small victories, like pebbles thrown into a pond, began to add up. In 1453, the 100 Years' War ended. The English were driven from most of France, and Charles VII, the man who had left Jeanne to die, remained on the throne for the rest of his life. He did not mention her much, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. But whether he said anything or not, the French remembered who had truly brought them out of the darkness. Nearly 25 years after Jeanne's death, a retrial was held, not out of a sudden kindness of the church, but out of political necessity. Charles VII needed to clear his name. But whatever the reason, the result was a recognition that Jeanne was innocent. The original verdict was overturned, and for the first time, the high priests themselves had to bow their heads and admit, "We have killed a man of God. And so, Jeanne began her journey beyond the borders of France. Literature, art, politics, all found in her a perfect symbol. William Shakespeare in Henry VI portrayed Jeanne as a witch disguised as a saint. But that was the view of an Englishman, in an era when England was still bitter about its failure. By the 19th century, when the Romantic movement arose, the image of Jeanne d'Arc was reimagined as a tragic heroine. Poets, painters, and composers began to paint her, sing about her, and write novels about her. During the French Revolution, Joan of Arc was borrowed as a symbol of the struggle against the monarchy. Then, during the Napoleonic era, she was honored as an ideal model of national spirit. During World War I, French soldiers carried Joan of Arc's picture in their pockets, considering her a spiritual guardian amid bombs and bullets. Even in the 20th century, Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the French resistance against Nazi Germany, once said, "Joan d'Arc is the model I always think of when making decisions." Jeanne became an exemplar of no ideology. Catholics venerated her as a saint. Nationalists saw her as a symbol of unity. Feminists saw her as a woman who broke the male chasm. And even atheists could not deny her extraordinary courage and determination. In 1920, after centuries of debate and controversy, the Catholic Church officially declared Joan of Arc a saint. The canonization ceremony was held in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, with thousands of faithful from around the world in attendance. From a girl who had been burned at the stake as a heretic, Jeanne officially became Saint Joan of Arc, and no one could ever reclaim that title again. But perhaps that title was not what Jeanne sought. What she wanted from the very first day was to follow the calling in her heart. She did not need a throne, did not need a monument, did not need even sainthood. What Jeanne left behind was not the pieces of armor she wore or the sword she wielded, but her unyielding spirit, a flame that could not be extinguished by fire. In the final part, we will look back at the whole journey, from a country girl to one of the greatest icons of humanity, and then close with a gentle wish, like the wind blowing through the ashes that have never truly cooled. Thus, from a peasant girl who had never held a sword, never traveled far from her village, Jeanne d'Arc stepped out of the fields of Domrémy and into the maelstrom of history. She not only fought, but also changed the course of a nation on the brink of collapse. But the paradox is that her holiness, her purity, and her unshakable faith were the reasons why the world of that time could not accommodate her. You see, Jeanne was not a general. She had no rank, no training in tactics, but she led an army with her unwavering faith. She inspired, she instilled hope, she stirred the dormant courage in the hearts of the French soldiers. As she held the white angel flag, standing amid the rain of arrows and dust, the army seemed to see something beyond logic, something that tactics could never give, faith. And then, when she fell, not in the middle of a battle, but in the middle of a sham trial, people thought they had extinguished the fire. But no, they only made it burn brighter. Because sometimes death is not the end, it is the door to immortality. We have been through it all together, from the first voice Jeanne heard in the fields, to her execution in the middle of the Rouen square, from the astonished gaze of the French soldiers at the sight of a girl leading her troops, to the cries of the people as she burned on the pyre. Each chapter of Jeanne's life is both tragic and brilliant, and because of that, Jeanne was never simply a historical figure. She was a symbol, an icon that transcends time, nationality, and religion. Because not all of us will hear the voice from heaven. Not all of us will don the armor of our faith. But in every person, there's a part of Jeanne, the part that refuses to be subdued, the part that stands up for what is right, even at the cost of its own life. Today, if you go to Rouen, where Jeanne was burned, you will see a modern church named after her, built right next to the old square. Inside, light streams through stained glass windows, spilling over the cold stone walls. And in the middle of the church, not a stern statue of a saint, but the figure of a young girl looking up at the sky, clutching a flag. No sword, no armor, just a determined gaze that says, I have no regrets. And that was Jeanne, not the saint from a catechism, not the legendary warrior from the history books, but an ordinary girl who dared to live an extraordinary life. She believed in what others laughed at, went where others feared, and in the end died with her dignity intact. We live in a world of choice, where information is overwhelming, where individual voices are lost in a sea of noise. But Jeanne, in the 15th century, amid the darkness of superstition, war, and prejudice, chose to stand up. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't need validation. And that's the most amazing strength. Thank you everyone for relaxing with today's story, whether it was during the day or late at night. I hope Jeanne's journey has left you with something, a small spark in your heart, to remind you that sometimes a strong enough belief can change the world. Good night, if you're listening, or a steady day, if you're starting your morning. See you in the next video.